actually something to pipe in on with rates. When rates are going up like they are right now, and we're probably going to continue to see that trend just a little bit. If you've been working with a buyer for, the past 30, 60 days and they're just kind of casual, I would recommend getting a new pre-approval before you actually make an offer, because what they got pre-approved with last month or even just a few weeks ago, their buying power has, decreased a little bit with the increase in interest rates. And so it's better to be proactive with that rather than getting into escrow on something and then having the lender, go to do the rate lock and getting a surprise of a quarter to a half point higher than what they were expecting, which may also, you know, kick them out of approval if they were already really close on the debt to income ratio there. So, all right, so let's go ahead and get started working with underrepresented buyers and how to use commonly misused forms. We'll go over the forms first. So I've done this one a couple times over the years. Addendum versus amendment. What is the difference? I've been in the business quite a long time. We always used addendums to, modify the contract and things like that. But that's actually not the correct form to use when you're modifying the contract, especially after you've been in escrow already. You want to use an amendment, and you want to amend the contract. So we're going to go over this a little bit. So we look at the thesaurus, and synonyms for addendum include addition, attachment, or supplement. Synonyms for amendment include change, modification, revision. So you can see how they are definitely different. Creation and purpose of the amendment. So in 2017, C.A.R introduced amendment of existing agreement terms. Even though this form has been around for almost 7-8 years, we still see many seasoned agents using the addendum form for modifications and even teaching newer licensees to do the same. Prior to 2017, almost everywhere, every form with C.A.R standard forms library, other than the purchase agreement that was intended to be signed by the buyer and seller, was called an addendum, regardless of when it was introduced into the transaction. So these forms include, but not limited to, extension of time addendum, backup offer addendum, additional signature addendum, short sale addendum, and just the addendum. So the AEA, which is the amendment, was created to minimize the problem of uncertainty from parties who signed an addendum to propose a change only to have the other party not agree and refuse to sign or ignore the proposed change. So the first line of the form identifies the AEA as a proposal, whose terms are specified in paragraph 1. And if you already have an accepted agreement, whether it be a listing or a purchase, and you want to make a change to that, then you're amending it. So this would be the proper form. So you can see this is a proposal to amend the terms and conditions of a purchase agreement or a lease or anything else that you have, really. I saw a few. Okay, that's Tim. Okay. So paragraph 2 provides that the proposal, like an offer or a counteroffer, expires automatically unless accepted by the other party in a specified time, defaulted to 3 days after it is signed. So in this instance, we're looking at the snippet of the amendment. You see that the expiration, it says the buyer or the seller proposes this amendment of existing terms, which may be withdrawn, yada, yada, yada. So it is good for 3 days, just as if it was a counteroffer or an offer. So in this instance, the buyer is proposing some change, and then section 3 for acceptance. If the seller decides that, yes, I would like to also make this change, I agree to it, then they will sign on that line right there. If the receiving party takes no action, then the proposal terminates and the terms of the contract remain unchanged. When the automatic expiration language in the AEA, the party initiating the request can make a decision on how to proceed without waiting indefinitely for a response from the other principal. And that's what could happen if you're using an addendum instead, because there is no timeline on that. So essentially you have something that is good for the forever, essentially, or until something closes or cancels. So when to use addendum versus amendment? In most cases, an addendum is intended to be attached to an offer or another document, so it supplements the other document's terms. It is especially useful if there is not enough room to write in all the terms to be added to the offer or other document, although the text overflow addendum function in zip forms reduces the need to attach a general addendum to supplement an offer or other document. I personally prefer the addendum if I know that what I want to write in there is going to be too long. The TOA is not my favorite, but it works just fine. I just personally like to see exactly what it is I'm writing. So I do prefer the addendum if the character space is not going to allow for what I want to say. An addendum, it's an open-ended offer that can be accepted anytime prior to its written withdrawal. So yes, you should always withdraw unaccepted addendums. So let's say you were trying to make a price change or something like that, and you send it on an addendum, and you're still going back and forth a little bit, and I don't know, something happens, and then all of a sudden now you're agreeing to maybe a different price. They could go back and sign this addendum at any point, and because there's no expiration on it. So maybe they like the first addendum you sent better than the second addendum, and they could accept that first addendum because it's not expired. So that's why you should use the amendment when you're proposing the change instead, because it will expire. An amendment is intended to be used after a contract has already been created and one party suggests a modification of the binding agreement. The AEA is a proposal and expires if not accepted. Specific form examples: request for repairs. The RR is issued after an offer is accepted, typically during the buyer's investigation period. Since it comes after the agreement, it works like an amendment, not an addendum. So, because you are amending the contract with a credit or a repair request or both or price reduction. So back in December of 21, expiration language is added to the RR so that if the seller does not respond in time to the RR, it expires, having the effect of letting the buyer know that their requests have been rejected. And right there we have a snippet of section 5 of the RR showing the expiration. So a reminder, if a buyer proposes a request for repairs, seller does not respond, deeming it revoked or rejected, the buyer must still perform on the RPA timelines, which with regards to releasing applicable contingencies or exercise the right to cancel. The contingency timeline does not automatically extend. So again, that's just a reminder, because I do hear that. We're like, oh, we're waiting to hear back from the seller on the RR. It's been like a week. Well, for one, it's already expired. And for two, your buyer probably is past contingency timelines. So it does not extend them. So let's look at the ETA, extension of time. The ETA has pre-printed language to extend escrow or give buyer more time to remove contingencies. So that would be section 1 and 2 of the ETA. And again, this is an amendment. This isn't an addendum. So we're amending, or we're proposing to amend the already agreed upon terms. Line 3 can be used to extend other timelines of the contract, such as the SIP form, RPA, any counteroffers, things like that. Extend the expiry dates of any of these forms. Simply using the ETA does not automatically extend the timeline, though. Both parties must agree. And there we have that. So this would be other extensions, would be number 3. If you wanted to extend some other timeline that is not escrow or contingencies, um, could be contractual things too, such as, you know, providing new pre-approval letters, or, I mean, there could be a number of things, you know, returning signed disclosures, things like that. Line 4 can be used to propose additional terms to any or all of the extension terms proposed, such as full or partial EMD release of the EMD to the seller in exchange for extension of time, additional per diem amount in the SIP. So that could be an addition, an increase in total rent, or the per diem for extension of seller in possession time. So this is where you could write that here in number 4. So you can say, you know, maybe the escrow is being proposed to be extended. And so you would check, you know, number 1, you put in the new date. And then number 4, you can say, hey, we're going to agree to this escrow extension, but we would like, whatever, partial earnest money released. We would like a, you know, a late fee, a per diem charge, you know, both, things like that. So that's where you would put that. Additional signature addendum. This thing used to be super confusing. So this form is used to add additional signatures when there are more than 2 on the purchase or listing. The 2025 revision simplified it quite a bit. This thing is much better than it used to be. So obviously everything that we sign only has signature spaces for 2, up to 2 sellers, up to 2 buyers. A lot of times we have an additional seller or an additional buyer or multiples. I think I've seen, you know, 5 and 6 sometimes, kind of crazy, but this is used to basically add those other people onto the transaction so they can be signers because they're legally required to be. So it is not an assignment of any agreement. And therefore you can see that this is an addendum and it's not an amendment. We're not amending anything. This is in addition to a purchase agreement or something like that, just adding the lines for the additional people to sign that need to sign. So you can see here that the persons or entities identified in paragraph 3 are additional signatories to the forms identified in paragraph 2, any street or whatever. So it's going to be between the buyer's name, check the buyer box, and the seller name, check the seller box. Could be vice versa. This could be housing provider and tenant, however you want to do it. It could be a listing agreement with additional, you know, signatories on it. So it could be between the broker, so the sellers and the broker. So you're going to check box in number 2, which forms are being signed. In this example, we have the purchase being signed, that this is being added to as an addendum. So the purchase agreement, disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship, all of the bundle essentially is what it is covering, the purchase of bundle if you check box for a purchase. So it covers all of that. You don't have to type it all in or anything like that. So we're saying that this is in addition to the purchase. And then number 3, by signing below, the undersigned acknowledges receipt of all the documents identified above, which would have been everything in this paragraph here, number 2 for the purchase. And if applicable, the liquidated damages and arbitration additional signature addendum attached. And number 2 agrees to the terms, conditions, representations, and disclosures in that particular document or documents. Only the new signatories need to sign below. For example, if X, Y, and Z are all buyers, X and Y previously signed the documents, only Z needs to sign here below. So this would be the third person. Again, check that box. We're adding an additional buyer here. Their printed name will be over on the right-hand side. Their signature will go to the left of that. And then if they have a title, such as if this is an entity sale, then it would be, trustee, or an LLC. It might be, maybe they're the secretary of the LLC or something like that. And you can add up to additional 4 people here. So that's how you add those in. So basically, I just went through this whole thing so we can scroll past this. Assignment of agreement amendment, C.A.R form AOAA. This used to say addendum. One of the more recent revisions changed it to amendment because they were correcting their contracts. So this is the correct form to use to amend or modify a purchase agreement when adding, deleting, or replacing a buyer on the purchase contract. So you do not use that ASA form. That is for more than 2 signers. That is the form you use. If you are removing a buyer, if you're adding a buyer, you're going to use this assignment of agreement amendment. So section 1 is the proposed change in buyer. So we're looking at 1C here, other assignment, and it says replacing a buyer and at least 1 original buyer remaining or deleting a buyer. So if you're removing somebody, you're going to put them on the next line down. It says buyer is being removed, is assigning all that buyer's interest in the agreement to new or remaining buyers named below. And now we have this new person coming in. You could do a partial assignment. You can do a total assignment. So if you wanted to do just add a buyer and not replace a buyer, you would check 1A, and that would be buyer is adding the assignee named below to the agreement and granting such assignee a partial interest in the agreement. A total assignment is none of these buyers are going to be closing on this house, and instead we're assigning this contract over to this new set of buyers or this new buyer. You see that in a wholesale deal or something like that usually, where it's a total assignment. Section 2 is the status of documents that have been delivered to the current buyer already and when the new buyer will sign and deliver the seller documents back to the seller. So we're looking at section 2 now of the AOAA form. 2A is delivery of prior documents. Prior documents already delivered to assignee is the default. Assignee acknowledges that the buyer has already provided the assignee all prior documents. So this would be, seller disclosures and all that fun stuff. Or you can check box 2, prior documents not yet delivered to the new person. Seller shall deliver to buyer and assignee a seller signed copy of this assignment of agreement addendum. That's funny, they have addendum in here. There should have been amendments. I guess I didn't change that. Upon receipt of the seller signed assignment, buyer shall immediately deliver to assignee prior documents. It could be pre-qual, pre-approval of assignees, time to return assignee initial prior documents. So that would be C2. Assignee shall deliver initial copies of all prior documents to seller within 3 days. We'll get down here. So sections A, B, and C must be adhered to. Otherwise, D1 or D2 may be enforced by the seller. So A, B, and C, these need to be checkboxed, or you can leave them as default as well, but the new buyer needs to be in compliance with them. Otherwise, D can come into effect, which would be from the seller side. So it would say effect or a failure to return or attach documents. Seller, after first delivering a notice to perform, may cancel this assignment, and the assignment shall have no further force and effect. 1, prior documents. If assignee does not deliver to seller all prior documents within this time specified in 2C, or the pre-approval or pre-qualification, if assignee does not attach same pre-qual or pre-approval from buyer's lender as required by buyer. So the seller can request, hey, I'm not going to sign off on this, or I will, but you need to deliver a pre-qual or pre-approval with this new buyer on there as well. So that is a stipulation in there. That one gets missed quite often, actually. Section 3 is to disclose any consideration the assigner may be receiving for the assignment. So, you know, if the person assigning the contract over to the new person is receiving money for doing so, maybe they're getting an assignment fee of $10,000 or something like that, that needs to be disclosed. And so that is going to be, it's defaulted to A, buyer has not received and will not receive any monetary compensation or consideration from assignee for this assignment. So that's typically, you know, adding in a buyer or removing a buyer. In a total assignment, though, more than likely they're receiving some sort of consideration for doing so. So they would check number 3B, checkbox add buyer has received or will receive consideration from the assignee in the amount of, and then you type in the amount. That's very important to disclose if that's happening. So A is the default, as no consideration is generally what happens with assignment requests. However, if there is consideration, money being paid to the assigner, it must be disclosed. It is also important to note that the assigner is not released from their obligations of the purchase as stated in lines 4 through 9, and that is that's very important, especially on a total assignment. The first signer, the first person that went under contract, is on the hook to make that deal close. So if they assign this out and that assigner or the assignee cannot close for whatever reason, it is going to fall back to the original person. So it does not relinquish them from the contract, but it does allow them to assign it out. But their obligation to close and all timelines still is in effect. Contingency for sale of buyer's property. So this one is not too difficult. It can get a little confusing, but this is what you're going to add in if you're making your purchase contingent upon the sale of their home. So it states where the buyer's contingency will be. Typically, the default option is A, is checkboxed. If A applies, then sections 2 and 4 must be completed. However, B or C also could apply and would need to be completed along with 2 or 4. So let's go through this a little bit. So this is contingency for sale of buyer's property. So in section 1 here, buyer's property contingency, the agreement is contingent upon the buyer entering into a contract for the sale of and close of escrow on this buyer's property. Or B would be, if you checkbox, only entering into a contract for the sale of buyer's property. Or C, only close of escrow of buyer's property. So leaving it defaulted to A is entering into contract and closing. Or you can break it up with B or C being just entering a contract or just closing. And you can, if that's already under contract, you would say, hey, the escrow is being held here. The escrow number is this, and that sale is set to close escrow on this certain date here. Section 2 is the timeline for the buyer entering into contract to sell their current property. Timelines can be left default or adjusted by typing in new days. These timelines will apply for the seller knows to perform should they not be adhered to. So number 2 says buyer entering into contract for the sale of buyer's property. So they're saying that, hey, 2A, we have 17 days after acceptance of this offer here to enter into contract for the sale of our property. So the buyer makes the offer, they have this form in place, they're telling the seller, hey, you're going to give us 17 days to get our home under contract. And then B says by the earlier of the time specified in 2A or within 2 days after buyer entering a contract for sale of buyer's property, buyer shall deliver escrow evidence to the seller and escrow holder. So let's say they go into contract on the home they're currently residing in. Day 15, they need to show the seller, hey, look, we're in contract now. So that's part of that contingency. Section 3 is the status of the listing of the buyer's property. So now they need to say, hey, the buyer has signed a listing agreement for the buyer's property, or shall, within defaulted by 3 days or some other amount of days, sign a listing with, and then, the company. So 3B would be buyer's property is or will be submitted to the MLS in the geographical area where the buyer's property is located, or buyer's property will not be submitted to the MLS in the geographical area where the buyer's property is located. And then C, buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of both the listing agreement and, if applicable, the MLS listing within 1 day after acceptance if the buyer's property is already listed with the real estate brokerage, or if not already listed within 1 day after the listing with the real estate brokerage. So the listing agent for the property that the buyer is trying to buy can ask for a copy of the MLS and of the listing agreement, proving that this property that the buyer is currently residing in has been listed. And that would just be good due diligence for the listing agent on the property that the buyer is trying to buy. Section 4 pertains to the sale of the property contingency from 1A or C. So close of escrow of buyer's property. If 1A or C applies, buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. One would be the scheduled close date of the seller's property. Or 2, if checked no later than 5 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow of seller's property. Once buyer's property closes, buyer can no longer use this contingency to cancel. This section can be confusing at first glance, however, it states that either the close of escrow for the purchase of the replacement property, which is the buyer's purchase, is the latest day the buyer's property's sale can close escrow. This would essentially mean a concurrent closing will need to take place for both properties. Depending on your county, such as Los Angeles, this might be impossible to perform. Or if checkboxed, the buyer property sale would need to close escrow 5 days or earlier by default from scheduled close of escrow of the replacement property. So this is important to make sure you're setting it up properly, because we run into this little snag a lot at close of escrow or getting close to escrow, where the replacement property is scheduled to close essentially on the same day as the buyer's property that they are selling. And that could be a problem in most cases, especially if you don't have any sort of SIP in place. If there's no seller in possession, basically you're saying, if the buyers are currently living in their home, they need to vacate still, and they probably need those funds to close on the loan on their replacement property. So you want to give yourself a little bit of time there, figure out what that scenario is, and if you can even do a concurrent closing, which many areas you can't, so it wouldn't even work. So now you're stuck with, some upset clients, because whoever is buying your buyer's house probably wants to move in because they just closed escrow. And if there's no SIP in place, your buyers need to vacate, yet they can't close on their new replacement property yet because they don't have the funds yet from the closing of their house, and they haven't vacated their current house yet because they don't have anywhere to go yet because they haven't closed. So make sure you build in some time for your clients and you assess, what these timelines are going to look like. Um, Sections 5 through 8 pertain to status updates, cancellations, backup offers, removal of the COP contingencies. So you'll want to run down these. So we'll skip down to 7 real quick. This one's important to checkbox properly. And if you're on the listing side, paying attention to number 7 is really important. So what you're saying here is backup offers and seller right to require buyer to remove contingencies or cancel. Backup offers. So after acceptance, seller shall have the right to continue to offer the seller's property for sale for backup offers. The parties acknowledge that brokers shall not violate MLS rules requiring accurate property status reporting. That's an important thing to remember because the seller is probably going to say to you as a listing agent, hey, I'm willing to take this buyer's contingent offer, but I want to keep my home active in MLS and see if another offer comes along that's non-contingent that we can close on faster, right? Well, that would be an MLS violation in pretty much MLS that I know of, because they require you to put it into a pending status or an active contingent status within 24 hours after acceptance. So if the seller is accepting this offer, technically you need to go and change the MLS status of the property. So be sure that you're explaining that properly to your client. 7B, removal of the buyer contingencies and proof of funds. So unless 7C is selected, if seller accepts a written backup offer and provides buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the time specified in 7C1, which is down here, we're getting to it, or 2, seller shall have the right to give written notice to buyer to, in writing, remove this contingency, so their contingency of purchase, remove the loan contingency, if any, and provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of buyer's property. Seller may use the bottom of page 2 of this form to comply with the written notice requirement of this paragraph. If buyer fails to complete these actions within 2 days after delivery of such notice, seller may then immediately cancel the agreement in writing. So this would be if a seller receives a backup offer that they would like to work with, they're going to say, buyer, we need you to remove the loan contingencies. We'll either remove the contingency of purchase or remove the loan contingencies, basically all contingencies, and also prove that you can still close on this property with proof of funds or something like that. So we get down to 7C, time to give notice to remove contingencies. So for the seller. Seller shall have the right to invoke the notice of provisions of 7B, which you just went over. Immediate right to notify the buyer anytime after acceptance. Well, if I'm on the listing side, truthfully, that's the one I want, because I want to be able to notify this buyer at any time that, hey, we got a backup offer that we want to work with, and you need to remove this contingency, or you need to show us proof that you can close without the funds from that house and remove your loan contingency. Or 2, which is what I usually see checkboxed, which is a delayed right to notify buyer. So the seller is saying no earlier than 17 days after I accept your purchase, buyer, I'm not going to serve you with a notice to remove this contingency. You have 17 days basically to get your home under contract and remove this contingency or the contingency specified in the first part of this this purchase, the addendum, COP. Number 3, now this one is the best one for the buyer, but unless my property has been sitting on the market for a year and it's really hard to sell, I'm probably not going to accept this one as a seller because it is not beneficial. It's very beneficial for the buyer though. So 7C3, no right to notify the buyer. Seller shall not have the right to invoke the provisions of paragraph 7B during the entire term of the agreement. So that's pretty harsh. If you are on the listing side and you see 7C3 checkboxed, I would highly advise removing that and changing it to either 1 or 2, 7C1 or 2, and compromise, because that's really binding your seller to being stuck with this buyer. And that's not what we want to do when we're on the listing side. Now, if we're on the buyer side, and if you get that signed, well, kudos to you. Like I said, I wouldn't agree to that if I was a listing agent, but that does benefit your buyer immensely. Section 9 through 11 pertain to cancellation of rights for the buyer and seller, as well as purchase contract timeline, start times. Seller right to cancel. So I don't think I'm going to go through this entire thing, but this talks about ways that you can cancel. It works like the purchase agreement, things like that. The buyer is going to receive a notice to perform from the seller. And then if contingencies or contractual obligations are not met, then the seller can go ahead and cancel the purchase after sending the notice to perform. Buyer right to cancel. Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing if prior to buyer's removal of the buyer's property contingency is applicable. So that's your 1A, B, and C. The other notable thing on this one to pay attention to is number 11. Time for performance of contract obligations and delivery of buyer deposit. So this is setting up how your escrow is going to run and when you have to start getting your inspections and appraisals and things like that done. So this is an important section as well when you're setting this up. So 11A, contract obligation other than deposit. So we're saying time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations, excluding those in this addendum, shall be specified in the agreement. Or if you check the box, on the day after the buyer delivers to seller any of the following: escrow evidence of the buyer's property, buyer's election in writing signed by the buyer to begin time periods, buyer's removal of this contingency for sale of buyer's property. So what it's saying is if you leave it as default, when you have an acceptance, the timelines are starting. So if you have, let's just say by default, 17 days for your inspections, your appraisals, and all of that, they're going to start upon acceptance. However, I usually recommend checking the box because that is stating that the timelines for all of that stuff for my buyer is not going to start until after we go into contract on the buyer's sale of their existing home, which is probably better for the buyer, because what could happen is you can go through, you can start your appraisal, you can start your inspections, the buyer's forking out money for all this stuff, and lo and behold, their home is not selling yet. For some reason it's not going on a contract, or maybe it did and then it fell out. Now the seller's starting to get in a position where they can cancel on the buyer and move on to another buyer because of the timelines. And now your client, the buyer, has forked out cash for the appraisal and inspections, and they're going to end up losing that money if they can't get back into performance and get their home under contract, essentially. So I do like to check box 11A and push those timelines out until we are ready to remove that contingency or show that my buyer's property is under contract. 11B pertains to the earnest money deposit. Buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within the time specified in the agreement, or within 3 business days after the buyer delivers to seller any of the following: escrow evidence of the buyer's property, buyer's election in writing, signed by the buyer to begin time periods, or buyer's removal of this property contingency. So I do see a lot of times where the buyer is okay to make an earnest money deposit right away, but not start their timeline. So that'd be 11A. So they would check box 11A saying, hey, we're not going to start timelines yet, but I will deposit my earnest money, which is 11B. If they want to wait to do anything, then they're going to check box B as well and move that out until they get their property under contract again. So this is pretty important to set up in the beginning when you're making this offer and hopefully getting it agreed to. Yeah, we're running a little late today. Sorry about that. Seller's purchase of the replacement property. This one does get confusing. So this addendum is used to create a contingency for the seller to be able to locate and or purchase a replacement property. So this is on the seller side. COP is on the buyer side. Section 1 creates a contingency for the seller to either locate a replacement property, to purchase within 17 days or any other amount, or state they have already located a replacement property and or also close on that replacement property. So that's going to be section 1 here. Finding a replacement property, again, defaulted to 17 days. You're saying, hey, buyer, you're not going to go away for the first 17 days, and you're giving us 17 days to go and find this replacement property. If you select B, you can change 17 to any other days as well. Or B, seller has already entered into contract to find replacement property, and this property contingency is removed. Here is the escrow holder, an escrow number, and if checked, close of the replacement property. So works a little bit like COP, but for the seller side. Section 2 are timelines for which contract timelines will take place. Again, we're a little bit similar here. Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, and all that start on day of acceptance, or if checkbox, other way around. Seller delivers to buyer written notice removing the finding replacement contingency specified in 1A, or remain as specified in the agreement. If close of escrow is identified as specific date in the agreement, it shall remain on that date. Buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within 3 business days after the seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing this contingency here, or as specified in the agreement. Close of escrow, parties agree, seller may extend close of escrow date for the sale of seller's property for a maximum of whatever additional days, 3, 5, a week, or until a certain date by providing buyer written notice. At the same time, seller removes the finding replacement contingency. Sections 3 and 4 pertain to cancellations of the seller's replacement property and contingency. Section 5 and 6 explain buyer and seller cancellation rights. Again, this is the buyer providing a notice to seller to perform on removing this. After the buyer has done that, then they can proceed to a cancellation. This would be if the buyer or if the seller is not finding a replacement property, or maybe not closing on that replacement property, then the buyer can deliver that seller notice to perform, which we don't see quite as often. Yeah, we're about 10 minutes after. I could probably go through this real quick. The unrepresented buyers. So this came up just as recently as this weekend. I get this one quite a bit, especially when writing the listing agreement. So I'll go ahead and kind of go through this real quick. Working with a buyer, we touched on this a week or two ago. What does it mean to be working with a buyer? There is an actual definition And I'm going to repeat it because it pertains to if you are working with an unrepresented buyer or not. So the working with language is intended to distinguish MLS participants who provide full or limited brokerage representation or services for the buyer, including transaction brokerage, such as identifying potential properties, arranging for the buyer to tour a property, performing or facilitating negotiations on behalf of the buyer, presenting offers by the buyer, or other services for the buyer from MLS participants who simply market their services or just talk to a buyer, like at an open house or providing an unrepresented buyer access to a house they have listed. If the MLS participant is working only as an agent or a sub-agent of the seller, then the participant is not working with the buyer. In that scenario, an agreement is not required because the participant is performing work for the seller and not the buyer. Authorized dual agents, on the other hand, work with the buyer and the seller. A written buyer agreement is required prior to the buyer touring the home. The MLS participant working with, in quotes, a buyer can enter into a written buyer agreement at any point, but must do so by no later than prior to the buyer touring the home. What is an unrepresented buyer? A purchaser who acts without any real estate representation, either from the listing broker, which could be the agent who took the listing, or another agent in a listing brokerage firm, or another brokerage company. Can a listing broker refuse to present an offer from an unrepresented buyer? General rule is no, because we have to present all offers, right? So just because they're not being represented doesn't mean that we can just simply not present their offer. So the listing broker, again, has a duty to the seller to present all offers received, unless otherwise instructed by the seller. If the listing broker is uncomfortable proceeding in a transaction with an unrepresented buyer, the listing broker should discuss this with the seller at the time of taking the listing. Possibly the listing broker is concerned about additional work, time, effort, risk that may result if the buyer is unrepresented, or that the transaction could be possibly more difficult, which it probably will be, especially if the buyer is unsophisticated and inexperienced. I think I had one come in real quick. So, question came in, what about when the seller chooses not to be represented, but has an agent advising them? Well, then they're being represented if they're being advised. Yeah, so I guess if you're on the buyer side, maybe that's what you're talking about. And the seller, so this would be a for sale by owner, it sounds like. And then there's somebody giving that seller, advice or information or something like that. Maybe they have a friend or something who's a real estate agent, giving them some pointers on how to sell their home. Technically, that agent is getting into an agency with that seller, and they need to be careful of that. Can a listing broker receive extra compensation if the listed property is purchased by an unrepresented buyer? Yes, absolutely. I call this the extra work fee. So paragraph 2C of the listing agreement, this is really what I wanted to cover. So paragraph 2C2 of the RLA, the residential listing agreement, provides for the seller to pay the listing broker additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. And I put that in an underline. This is not dual agency right here that we're talking about. This is an unrepresented buyer. They have no agent. You're not representing them. It's for sale by owner in reverse. Yeah, so you can see right here when we're filling out this, the RLA, C2, you check the box, additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented. In parentheses, it says it again, does not apply to dual agency. If an unrepresented buyer comes along and says, I want to make an offer on this house and I want you to represent me, that is dual agency, and this fee does not apply whatsoever. That is you getting a buyer rep agreement in place with the buyer, and then you stating what commission you want to earn um, on the purchase agreement to your seller. That is how you earn both fees. This fee right here is for when the buyer has no representation, it is not dual agency, you just have extra work because you still need to facilitate this transaction on behalf of the seller. So that includes not writing the offer for the buyer on the terms that they want. That would be advising, and now you're getting into agency, and then essentially that's representation. So what you can do, you can provide blank forms. You can provide a blank form to them. You know, can you write an offer from the seller to the buyer? I mean, I guess I've seen that where this is what the seller is willing to agree to, take it or leave it. But essentially, you can provide the blank forms. You cannot explain to them how to fill them out. When you send seller disclosures over to them, you're not advising them on what it is. You're just providing them. You need to open up the door for inspections, for appraisal. You need to let them do their final walkthrough. So you're opening the door extra times and things like that. So yes, there is extra work involved in dealing with an unrepresented buyer. Just as a side note, if you have an unrepresented buyer, you want to add in the form BNA, buyer non-agency, to your disclosures package, or while you're negotiating the offer is actually better, basically as soon as practical, because you want to put it out there right away. You are not advising them. This is buyer non-agency. So that's really the main thing I wanted to go over, because this question comes up a lot still on C2, thinking that, okay, if I put, you know, an amount here on C1, that's the amount I'm going to get. And then in C2, if I bring in a buyer, then that's the amount I'm going to get. And that is completely incorrect. So just remember, this is for non-agency whatsoever. So any questions on that, throw them in the chat. There's a couple little Q&As here. I can run through these real quick if you want to stick around. So we had one come in. That confuses me. If I am answering that buyer's questions, then I am representing them. That is correct. When do we make that buyer sign A, B, or B, C? When are those lines crossed contractually? And they are crossed when you start answering, well, I guess it depends on the questions. Are they asking questions about the property? Because that's different. They're asking you how to fill stuff in, or what should I do, or can I do this? Now you're advising them, and technically, yes, you need to have an agency agreement in there. Will they sign a BRBC? Probably not. Now you're getting into a position of gratuitous agent, meaning you're working for free because you probably already have this deal in escrow, and you've put yourself into an agency position with them because you started advising them on things they should do, or answering questions that they have about, you know, let's say the seller disclosure or something like that, and how to respond to it. Really, it's just like, here's the forms, read them and figure it out. That, you know, they can seek the advice of an attorney or something like that, which is probably going to, you know, cost them more in the long run anyways. So true, got it. So which form should we have them sign? BNA, buyer non-agency, is what you're going to have them sign, and keep an arm's length distance away from those buyers on answering any questions that don't pertain to the property itself. It's when they start asking questions about how to do things and stuff like that. That's when you're getting into agency. So advising. You can answer questions about the house. That's just like someone walking into an open house as well. How many bedrooms are here? There's 3. Is there an HOA? Yes. You know, that's not advising. Why might a listing broker ask the seller for additional compensation for buyers unrepresented? Which went over that. You know, all the extra work that comes in there with opening doors and providing blank contracts and dealing with someone who's just trying to, cut fees or something like that and making it more difficult for everybody essentially. Can a seller refuse to receive offers from unrepresented buyers? Yes, but there's little incentive to do so, and they would have to instruct you explicitly that they don't want to receive those offers, and that needs to be in writing. So I wouldn't recommend that. The offer may be professionally prepared by an experienced investor or poorly prepared by a novice purchaser. It is most likely that in the seller's best interest to receive all offers, even those from unrepresented buyers, and then decide how to respond, if at all, to such offers on their merits, including taking into account that the buyer is unrepresented. Can a listing broker provide a purchase offer form to an unrepresented buyer? Yes, C.A.R terms of use allow a broker to provide forms to any party in a transaction for which the broker is acting as an agent. A listing broker who does so should first get permission of the seller. To reduce the risk of creating an agency relationship with the buyer, listing brokers should not fill in any substantive terms or blank fields of the offer, but instead should only include the property address, buyer's name on the form. You have to do that by default, otherwise you can't send the form. The broker can also name the listing brokerage as the seller's only agent in the agency confirmation paragraph. That's what you're going to want to do to show that you are not representing them. There will be no selling side brokerage designated. So don't put Rise Realty twice, only on the listing side. If a listing broker gives an unrepresented buyer a blank offer, what else should the broker do or not do? The broker should provide the buyer with buyer non-agency, the BNA. The broker should not discuss terms with or help the unrepresented buyer complete the offer. The broker should remind the buyer that the broker is acting in the capacity as the seller's broker only, with any further communications with the unrepresented buyer, and should refer the buyer to previously provided BNA form. How should the seller respond to an offer written by an unrepresented buyer? Offer should be evaluated on its own merits by considering the offer's terms and presentation. A relevant factor could be the fact that the buyer is underrepresented. Seller should or could decide to not respond at all, reject, accept the buyer's offer, issue a counter offer to the buyer's offer, and that's where basically you're going to do a lot of cleanup of how they wrote that offer most likely. If the buyer's offer is poorly written or does not contain terms approved by the seller, it may be best in the counter offer to reject the buyer's offer in its entirety and refer to and include with the counter offer a new purchase agreement offer prepared by the listing broker on behalf of the seller with terms acceptable to the seller. The listing agent or other agent in the same broker company as a listing agent prepares an offer for the buyer. Will that buyer be represented by the brokerage company? If the agent for the brokerage company had previously obtained the buyer's signature on a buyer representation agreement, BRBC or PSRA, then that buyer is represented and the brokerage company will be a dual agent. If the buyer has not signed a buyer representation agreement, either previously or prior to concurrently with signing the offer, then the agency, if any, will be determined by the circumstances. And then lastly, if the agent preparing the offer merely provides the buyer with a blank form and also provides the buyer with a buyer non-agency agreement, and the agency confirmation paragraph in the offer identifies the listing brokerage as seller's agent only, then agency should be avoided and the buyer will be unrepresented. So that's, I guess, about it. I have one other question. Nope, that's it. So sorry we ran long today. I thought that was going to fit in, but I got a little wordy with the COP because I wanted to make sure we were pretty clear on how that one works and setting up the deal properly in the beginning. So if you have any questions, always give me a call. I like to go over these things periodically, because, you know, these are kind of questions that we get on a weekly basis. So it's good to review them. And this recording will be available in the office, in the training and motivation page, as well as this handout, and also in the private Facebook group. So again, any questions, let me know. But otherwise, hope you have a great week. And we'll see you, is it next week? Yeah, I think next week we're going to be around. So, okay, we'll talk to you later.